My grandfather came from Russia. He was born in Leningrad and lived there during World War II. When we were kids, he told us many stories about his own childhood. There was one story in particular that absolutely horrified me. He told it only once and refused to speak about it again, but he swore it was true. During World War II, in September 1941, the German army had surrounded the city of Leningrad and blocked off all the roads. Nobody could get in or out. They called it the Siege of Leningrad, and it was one of the longest and most destructive sieges in history. Hitler was determined to seize the city, and he didn't care how many buildings he had to destroy or how many innocent people he had to kill. In fact, his plan was to cut off all supplies and starve the entire population to death. After a year of this, over 100,000 people were dead and the streets were littered with rotting corpses. At the time of the siege of Leningrad, my grandfather was only 6 years old. He lived in an apartment building near the center of the city with his mother and his 2 older sisters. At first, he said, it was not so difficult, but then the food began to run out. With each passing day, it became harder and harder to survive. There was barely anything to eat. Some days, he managed to get a crust of bread, but other days he had to go hungry. The city was in chaos. People began eating animals and pets. They caught stray cats, stray dogs, rats and so on and ate them all. When there were no animals left, the cannibalism began. On the first floor of the building where my grandfather was living, there were 4 apartments. All of them were inhabited. My grandfather and his family lived in the first apartment. The second was occupied by a woman and her 2 sons. The third was occupied by a man and his wife. 2 middle-aged sisters who had never married were living together in the fourth. One night, my grandfather was lying awake in bed, unable to sleep with the hunger. All of a sudden, he heard terrible screams and cries for help, which woke the whole family. It sounded like they were coming from one of the neighboring apartments. His mother's name was Zinaida and she was a very brave woman. She decided to check what was going on, despite the pleas of her frightened children. She gave them strict instructions to lock the door and not to open it for anyone. She left and the children did as they were told. Standing in the corridor, his mother noticed that the door of the next apartment was slightly ajar. This one was occupied by a woman who had 2 young sons. Zinaida walked slowly to the door and cautiously peered inside. What she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. Scared to death, she ran back to her own apartment and begged her children to let her back in. When my grandfather and his sisters opened the door, their mother burst in and slammed it shut behind her. She was out of breath and her face was pale. She got them to help her barricade the door and only then would she tell them what she had seen. On the floor, in a pool of blood, lay a severed hand, she said. There was a sickening stench of blood and from the depths of the apartment, I could hear disgusting chomping sounds. When they heard that, the older sisters became very upset. My grandfather was so terrified, he ran to the bedroom and hid under the bed. The next day, when his mother went out into the corridor again to take a look around, she saw that the door of the next apartment was firmly closed. Everything was deathly silent. After several weeks, the situation in the city improved a bit. The Russian army managed to open up one narrow supply route, so some food was able to get through. None of my grandfather's family had died from starvation, but they were all very weak. One morning, his mother gathered together what little money they had and went to see if there was any food she could buy in the streets. When she came back, she noticed that the door of the third apartment was hanging on one hinge. This one was occupied by a man and his wife. Guessing what happened there, Zenaida pushed the door open and peeked inside. In the dim light, she could just make out two crumpled figures lying on the floor. Most of the meat had been stripped from their bones. Sick to her stomach, she returned to her own apartment. After telling her children the horrible news, she barricaded the door once again. However, they couldn't continue like this for long. Soon, their meager food supplies had run out. They had to get more or they would certainly starve to death. Zenaida summoned the strength to get up and leave the apartment. No sooner had she taken a couple of steps down the corridor than she saw the door of the fourth apartment open. There were two middle-aged sisters living there and one of them came out. The woman looked unusually good. All of the residents of the city were very thin and emaciated, but this woman looked healthy and even a little fat. The woman smiled and said, "Hello." Then, she started walking towards Zenaida. Something about the woman's manner set her on edge and she began to slowly back away. Looking over her shoulder, she caught sight of the second sister, who was creeping up behind her. The woman was clutching a huge axe in her hands. Zenaida let out a strangled scream. She was trapped in the corridor and there was nowhere she could run. The two sisters closed in, licking their lips in anticipation of their next meal. Salvation came unexpectedly. As it turned out, my grandfather's older sisters saw what was happening. At that very moment, a group of Russian soldiers were passing by on the street outside. The children opened the window and called out to them, screaming and begging them to come to the rescue. Without thinking twice, the soldiers ran into the entrance and quickly made their way up the stairs. When they came to the first floor, they saw the two fat women trying to drag a skinny woman into an apartment. The soldiers leveled their rifles and ordered the women to stop fighting. The fat woman with the axe took a swing at the soldiers and they shot her right between the eyes, blowing her brains all over the wall. The soldiers ordered the other two women to lie down on the floor and began questioning them. Zenaida burst into tears and told them that the two sisters were cannibals and they had already eaten the inhabitants of two apartments and were about to eat the tenants of a third. When the soldiers searched the other apartments and came across the half-eaten remains, they realized she was telling the truth. Thus, the soldiers rescued my great-grandmother and her family. They ordered the remaining sister to kneel down on the ground and executed her on the spot with a bullet to the back of the head. That was the punishment for cannibalism at the time. A year later, the Russian army managed to push the Germans back and the siege of Leningrad ended. Over 1,500,000 people had died and another 1,500,000 had been evacuated. Somehow, my grandfather and his family managed to survive the whole thing. After all, those two fat sisters had a lot of meat on their bones.
Samantha had two best friends named Jenny and Amber. Her father was taking her on a weekend vacation and she invited them to come along. Her family owned a cabin in the woods and on Friday evening, her father drove the girls up there. "See that lake?" asked Samantha when they arrived. "That's Lake Samantha. My dad grew up here. He loved it so much, he named me after it." That night, after they had unpacked their things, the three girls sat around and thought of ways to amuse themselves. "Does anyone have any spooky stories?" asked Amber. "I have one," said Jenny. "It's a true story, too. It happened to a friend of a friend mine. She was babysitting these two little kids one night. She's sitting in the dark by herself watching TV and the phone rings. She goes over and answers it and hears a voice on the other end breathing really heavy, and it says, "Have you checked on the children?" "Jenny, come on," Amber interrupted. "Everybody's heard that one. That's the lamest scary story ever. Does anyone else have a story? One that's actually true?" "I know one," Samantha said. "About 10 minutes hike from here, there's an old broken down house. We passed it on the way up here. It's out in the middle of nowhere, tucked away off a narrow little side road. A long time ago, a man lived there. His family were really wealthy and they owned hundreds of acres of land around here. This man met a simple country girl from a simple country town and they fell in love. His family wasn't too happy about it. They didn't think the girl was good enough for him, but he ignored them. He was an independent type of guy and he went off and built a little house on a chunk of their land, out in the middle of nowhere. He married this girl and everything was wonderful. They had a daughter and eventually they had a son. This is where the story starts to go bad. Their son was sick. Not physically but mentally. He was sick in the head. He wasn't mentally disabled or anything. He was just a little off. By the time he was 9 years old, he became too much for his parents to handle, throwing temper tantrums, erratic sleeping patterns, disappearing into the woods and hiding, that kind of thing. Not knowing what to do about his son, the man turned to his family for help. His parents had the boy taken away. They sent him to a place deep in the woods. It wasn't an insane asylum, but it catered to people with special needs, if you know what I mean. His parents thought it was for the best. Over time, the family got used to not having him around. They gradually stopped visiting him. They functioned as if they had never even had a son and everything went back to being wonderful again. 8 years later, the boy, who was about 16 or 17 at this time, managed to escape from the hospital. The staff did a search, but he was nowhere to be found. His family was notified and they were devastated. They were worried for his safety. He had been alone in the wilderness for weeks and he was probably dead. But the boy wasn't dead. One night, he found his way back home. He crept into his house and, one by one, he slaughtered his entire family. His father, his mother, his sister. All of them chopped to pieces. With the blood still dripping from his axe, he disappeared into the woods. When the grisly remains of his family were discovered a few days later, the townsfolk in the surrounding area were horrified. The police tried to find the boy, but it was no use. To this day he has never been found. Since then, every year, around harvest time, people have started to go missing. And in their place, a corn-husk doll would be left behind. Legend has it, the boy still roams the woods around these parts. The surrounding towns have bought into the legend and they hang dolls by their front door for protection. They say if the boy sees a doll hanging from the door of a house, he will pass that house by and leave the residents in peace. Nobody knows if it's true or not, but there's a doll hanging from the door of every house in town. "That's so creepy," cried Jenny. "Do you have a doll on your door?" "Of course," said Samantha. "My dad says he doesn't believe the legend, but we hung one just in case." "I think I just soiled my underwear," said Amber. Apparently, the house is still haunted by the ghosts of his murdered family, and if you go up there late at night, you can hear the whole thing take place all over again. Do you think we could go up there? Jenny asked. Sure, said Samantha, but tomorrow, during daylight. There's no sense in tempting fate. That night, the girls slept in the same room and huddled together, trying to pretend they weren't frightened by the story and expecting to hear something tapping at the window at any moment. The next morning, Samantha's father made them all a big breakfast and they went down to the lake for a swim. Around noon, they decided to make the trip up to the old haunted house. When they got there, the girls sensed an eerie presence in the old, dilapidated place. It was enough to make their skin crawl. They explored the ruins of the old house, peeking into corners and sifting through the rubble. After a while, Samantha spotted something half buried in the dirt. It was some sort of book. She dug it out and dusted it off. The girls gathered around as she opened it and began to flip through the yellowed pages. It's like a diary or something, said Samantha. Maybe it's his diary, Jenny whispered. Whose diary? Asked Amber. The guy, said Jenny. The guy that killed his family. Samantha read the diary aloud as the others listened. There's a dedication inscribed inside the cover, she said. It reads, "To my family who I love and cherish and who will always be with me." September 5, 1987. It has been hard alone. All they had to do was talk to me. They could not talk to me. I hear their voices late at night sometimes. I hear their screams. It is cold and dark. I needed love. They did not love me. The medicines are gone. I am free, free from all of them. If they could not love me, they had to go. Dark sleep for everyone. I hear their voices still. Always screaming. December 4, 1987. They have stopped looking for me. It is okay for me now. I live in the forest. I chase down the animals and put them in dark sleep. Just like mom and dad and sis. I visit my old house at night. I listen to the voices. At least they talk to me now. October 3, 1995. I left the forest years ago and moved to a small town nearby. Nobody recognizes me. No one knows who I am. I hear people telling my story sometimes. It makes me laugh inside. They all fear me. I still come to the forest sometimes. I spend the nights in my old house. Mom and dad still talk to me. They say they are very proud of me. November 2, 1998. Life has been good. I found a job. I bought a house. I met a girl. She is very quiet and pretty. Sometimes I bring her to the forest. She likes it. I let mom and dad see her. They like her. July 1, 2000. Today is a great day. I have a baby now. I am so happy. Mom and dad are grandparents now. My wife isn't doing so well, though. It was hard for her. She might not make it. Maybe she will go in dark sleep. I am happy now. August 13, 2010. I am so proud of my child. She is just like me. Except she is much smarter. She has no problems. She doesn't hear the voices. She goes to school and has lots of friends. Not like me. Sometimes I take her to the woods. I love her so much. I named her after the lake. Samantha. For a few moments after Samantha stopped reading, there was a stunned silence. What the heck? Cried Jenny. Samantha, is this some sort of joke? Amber asked nervously. It isn't funny. This can't be true," Samantha whispered. "It couldn't possibly be." Just then, they heard the sound of twigs snapping behind them. When they turned around, they saw Samantha's father standing there. There was a strange, pained look on his face and he was holding an axe in his hands. "You weren't supposed to find that," he muttered. "There's no other way now. Dark sleep for everyone." "No, Dad," Samantha screamed. "No, no, no, no." When Samantha's father had finished chopping up the bodies, he put the pieces in large plastic bags and buried them deep in the woods. So deep that no one would ever find them. Now they could be together forever. "I'll watch over you now," he mumbled as he patted down the earth with his shovel. "You may not understand now, but you will in time. This is the only way for us to be together. Dark sleep forever. We all stay together." When I dropped out of school, it wasn't easy to find work. Nobody seemed to want to hire a girl with no qualifications. I was tired of applying for jobs advertised in newspapers and on the internet without receiving any replies. One day, I spotted an ad for a job that was not so tempting, but I really needed the money. The ad said they were looking for a live-in babysitter to take care of 3 young children. It said no qualifications necessary, they just required someone young, responsible and pretty. I called the number and the phone was answered by a woman with a sweet and friendly voice. When I told her I was calling about the babysitting job, she hired me on the spot. She didn't even want to meet me in person first, but she said she needed me to start immediately. I was delighted. The next morning, I drove over to the house to meet the family. As soon as I got there, I saw that the house was beautiful both inside and out. You could tell that the family was wealthy. The woman and her husband greeted me with broad smiles on their faces and introduced me to their children. There were 2 boys and a girl. Sebastian was 6 years old, Damien was 5 and Lenka was 4. The kids seemed to be nice, happy and friendly. They were always polite, never fought with each other and never made a mess. All they did was play alone or read a book. The parents announced that they were going out to dinner and wouldn't be home until late that night. They told me the children had already been fed, so all I had to do was get them ready for bed. The mother gave me a phone number and told me to call her if there was an emergency. The father told me to make myself at home and if I was hungry, he said I could take whatever I wanted from the refrigerator. After their parents left, the children sat down on the sofa to watch TV. They were very quiet and barely said a word. During a commercial, I was feeling a bit hungry, so I went into the kitchen to make myself a snack. As I was rummaging around in the refrigerator, I couldn't help but notice 2 large jars that were stuffed in the back of the fridge. Both of them were wrapped in plain brown paper and had a rubber band sealing the rim. I wondered what on earth could be in them. My curiosity got the better of me, so I took out one of the jars and peeled back the brown wrapper to take a little peek. It was full of long strips of fatty meat floating in a murky red liquid. I couldn't tell what kind of meat it was, but it didn't look like pork or beef. Just as I was about to put the jar back where I found it, I heard a noise behind me. It startled me so much, I banged my head on the shelf above me. When I turned around, Sebastian was standing in the doorway, staring at me. "Put that back," he said. "That's not for you." The look in his eyes and the tone of his voice sent chills down my spine. Sorry, I muttered. I was just looking for something to eat. Sebastian didn't reply. He just stood there, staring at me. I placed the jar back in the refrigerator and shut the door. Sebastian turned around and went back into the living room. I had lost my appetite, so I joined the children in the living room and watched cartoons with them. I was trying not to let my imagination get the better of me when the cartoons finished and the news came on. There was a story about a teenage girl who had gone missing. The police found her decomposing head in a dumpster. They said they had no idea what had happened to the rest of her. I was afraid the grisly news story would upset the children, so I changed the channel and told them it was time for bed. The kids didn't complain. They just walked up the stairs in single file and went to their bedroom. I put them in their pajamas and got them ready for bed. Then, I tucked them in, kissed them all goodnight and switched out the lights. When I went back downstairs, I was bored and had absolutely nothing to do, so I decided to watch a movie. I looked through the family's DVD collection, but all they had were cartoons and Disney movies. I wasn't in the mood for any more kids' stuff. On the bottom shelf, I spotted some old VHS tapes. One of them had a strange title. It was Girls. This seemed rather curious, so I decided to take a look at it. I put the videotape in the VCR and pressed play, then sat down on the sofa and made myself comfortable while the video started. The first thing I noticed was that it was a home video. The family must have recorded it themselves. The parents and children were all laughing and looking like they were having fun. I was about to turn it off when I happened to notice someone else in the video. It was a girl who looked like she was in her late teens. It seemed like she was the previous babysitter. She looked very familiar. It seemed like I recognized her from somewhere. Perhaps she went to my school. Then it finally hit me. Oh my freaking God, I thought. It was the missing girl from the news report. My hands were shaking. My whole body was trembling. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. I jumped out of my seat, ejected the video and put it back in its case. Then I remembered the jars in the refrigerator. I had to see what was in those jars. With a shudder, I went to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Maybe I'm just overreacting, I thought. I reached and took out the second jar. Peeling back the brown paper wrapper, I could see long pale hunks of meat and strips of fat floating in the red liquid. Some of the meat looked like it had skin on it. Human skin. I could also see what looked like strands of hair. Long hair. Human hair. I was so scared, I felt like I was about to pee my pants. I ripped off the rubber band that was sealing the jar and peered inside. There was an eyeball staring back at me. Horrified, I dropped the jar and it smashed on the kitchen floor. I ran to the living room, put on my jacket, grabbed the videotape and stuffed it into my pocket. When I came out to the hallway, Sebastian was standing at the foot of the stairs. "Where are you going?" he asked. I just remembered, I stammered. I forgot something. I have to go home and get it. I'll be back in a few minutes. Damien and Lenka came running down the stairs. "You can't go," screeched Damien. "You can't leave us on our own." "I'm calling our parents," shouted Lenka as she picked up the phone and began dialing numbers. Sebastian grabbed hold of my leg and wouldn't let go. "You have to stay," he squealed. "We're hungry." His grip was extremely tight, but I managed to shake him off and ran out the front door. As I dashed to my car, I saw the parents pulling into the driveway. I didn't stop for a moment. I just jumped into my car and locked all the doors. The children were on the doorstep, screaming and crying. The mother and father got out of their car and they came running over. There was an angry look on their faces. "What's wrong?" they shouted. "Where are you going? Come back here." I didn't answer. I just turned the key in the ignition and revved the engine. They started banging on the windows. I floored the accelerator and tore out of there like a bat out of hell and never looked back. I didn't stop until I came to the police station. I told the police officers everything I knew and handed over the videotape as evidence. The police immediately dispatched 2 patrol cars. By the time they arrived at the house, the parents and children were gone. They just took their car and disappeared. The police searched the house and found the jars in the refrigerator. They also found human flesh and bones in the basement. They did tests and confirmed that these were the remains of the missing girl. They never managed to track down the parents or the children. They're still out there somewhere, probably living under a different name, probably still on the hunt for new victims. If you want my advice, be careful who you are babysitting for.